Hey everyone, hope you're all having a great day. So it's been a little over a year since I started playing Overwatch, and after a bit of a grind, I've finally managed to reach Grandmaster on Tank. I've already made a video talking about my general thoughts about reaching GM based on my experience on damage and support, and for this video I wanted to do the same thing for the tank role. In total, I have about 100 hours of experience playing competitive on Tank, and about 80 hours in Unranked. While I'm certainly not the most seasoned Overwatch tank player, I do want to share a bit of my experience. Similar to damage and support, I finished the climb on GM pretty much as a one-trick, and for tank, my go-to pick was of course Zarya. As an aim-tracking enthusiast, Zarya is the tank I have the most fun playing, and in general, even though she does get soft-countered by quite a few heroes, including other tanks, I think she has decent ways of dealing with those weaknesses. In particular, I just like being able to cleanse anti-nade, because anti-nade is really annoying to play against as a tank. One of the first things I noticed is that tank gameplay compared to the other roles is very much reliant on fundamentals in order to do well. It's of course true that fundamentals are important on every role, however I think it's fair to say that tanks occupy a significant portion of the team's responsibilities, and therefore it is extra important to get the fundamentals right. In addition, tanks don't have too many options to mechanically outplay your opponents, which means that you are particularly dependent on good game sense and decision making in order to secure value. And with responsibilities come a lot of opportunities to make mistakes, which means it's very important to know what mistakes you can make so that you can hopefully try not to make them as often. Starting from my experience as a beginner, much of my fundamental understanding of tank gameplay came from watching A10's Unranked GMs, where he walks you through his PowerPoint slides about Overwatch, going over fundamentals like space, cooldowns, cover, etc. The video that I'm referencing is his first Overwatch 2 Unranked GM on Zarya, which I will link in the description, and his PowerPoint can be found right at the start of the video. I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't seen it before. Of course, watching a video, no matter how educational, isn't going to immediately make you a GM, but I think having a clear picture of how Overwatch works can really accelerate the rate at which you are able to figure out how the game works over time. Tank abilities in particular are very important because they determine your ability to take and hold space. If you waste those abilities, there are much greater consequences compared to, say, missing a Helix rocket on Soldier. The consequences aren't usually immediately obvious, but even wasting one cooldown can eventually lead to a snowball effect that results in you losing the overall teamfight. As a tank, you have limited range and limited abilities to catch enemies by surprise and secure quick eliminations, so you have to be more methodical when trying to create value. Tanks can of course still get eliminations when the enemy team makes mistakes, but your outplay potential very often comes from the smaller things, like forcing cooldowns or forcing the enemies to move back, and from the accumulation of smaller outplays, you can snowball a teamfight. As a result of this fact, the second thing I've noticed about tank is that the carry potential is a little bit more limited compared to the other roles, which means that there's going to be quite a few games that at the very least feel out of your control. Of course, that's not to say that I think you shouldn't take responsibility for your own mistakes while playing tank, but I'm just saying that finding ways to quote-unquote carry your team is a bit trickier while playing tank. To clarify what I mean, in the past I've referred to tank as not being very impactful, and I think people have misunderstood what I mean by that. When talking about impact, I'm referring specifically to carry potential. People have pointed out to me that tank diffs are really bad, and of course I would have to agree. Tank definitely has the highest throwing potential in the game. However, at least in my opinion, tank has the lowest carry potential out of all the roles. To illustrate the difference, here's a thought experiment. Try to think about what's worse, an AFK tank or an AFK DPS. Probably an AFK tank, hence why I say tank has a very high throwing potential. On the other hand, try to think about what's harder to deal with, a smurfing Sojourn or a smurfing Winston. Probably Sojourn. Of course, that's not to say that being a great Sojourn player is easy, but my point is that the ceiling for carrying your games can be much higher on non-tank roles. The most straightforward way to win games of Overwatch is of course by insta-killing the enemies, but you can't really do that as a tank. Indirect value by absorbing cooldowns and distracting the enemy team is essentially your way of trying to win the game on tank. And depending on what kind of player you are, the team-enabling indirect value playstyle may not be what you're looking for. So if you want to be the MVP playmaker of your team, tank is most likely going to be exceedingly frustrating to play. Unfortunately, it can often be quite difficult to win games through indirect value alone, because at some point the indirect needs to be converted to direct, and that step can sometimes be very team dependent. You don't want to try quote-unquote carrying your games because if you try and force a play to happen, you're very often just going to end up overextending yourself and feeding. On some games, you might feel like you're carrying, but I often find that games only feel that way if either the enemy tank is throwing or if you have the better DPSs. It's important not to expect that to happen every game, because if you do, you're going to end up making tons of mistakes. Tank, in most cases, is very much a game of patience and waiting for windows of opportunity. Beyond gameplay, the third notable thing about tank is that you get flamed a lot. Whether you're winning or losing, or whether you're playing well or not, there will always be someone who wants to complain about your gameplay. The moment that things go even slightly in the wrong direction, players will love to point their fingers at the tank first. If you're the kind of person that's easily influenced by what other people say, I would highly recommend muting both text and voice chat. While there is a chance that you'll miss out on legitimately useful communication, to be honest, the chance of that happening is so much lower that if you're negatively affected by silly people, it's better just to turn off all communication entirely, specifically when you're playing tank. For me personally, I just ignore any silliness that comes with gamers trying to communicate, so for me, I just leave the chat on. As the tank, you're almost always the most visible person on your team as a result of being the quote-unquote frontline. As a result, when a teamfight is lost and everybody is looking to blame someone else, there's a very good chance that your backline is going to point their fingers at you, even if you're not the one that made the biggest mistakes, just because you were the one they were looking at the most. For some reason, many non-tank players genuinely believe that tank is the strongest role, and will expect you to carry the team, even though your direct carry potential is probably the lowest out of everybody else. Ultimately, teammates that complain the most are usually going to be the ones trying to cope for their own shortcomings, and as a tank player, you are very likely going to be the victim of this fact quite often. So if you want to be a successful tank player, it's really important to understand that you will be flamed no matter what you do. Sure, if you're honest, sometimes you will be the one underperforming on your team, but remember that you're just trying to play and perhaps improve at the game just like everybody else. And sometimes learning the game means making some mistakes that might just cause you to lose some games. The important thing to remember is don't be afraid of disappointing random strangers on the internet. Getting flamed is just part of the tank experience. The fourth thing about tank is that there is a lot of counter swapping. What I've noticed is that there is pretty much always going to be someone on the enemy team that wants to try and counterpick your hero specifically, especially if you happen to be doing well. And oftentimes, if you're doing well, you can even expect multiple people to be trying to counter you at the same time, despite the fact that there are 4 other people on your team. In particular, I find that the enemy tank is almost always the first one to swap, and the hero they swap to is almost always the tank that is in theory supposed to counter your pick, even if the thing that's actually giving them the most trouble is someone else on your team. The reality is that countering the tank is easy, reliable, and obvious value, and so you should expect to be countered constantly as a tank player, even if you're underperforming already. Many of the heroes in the tank role have very one-dimensional playstyles, and therefore have relatively easy to exploit weaknesses. So if you're the kind of person that doesn't like being constantly countered, then tank probably is once again not the role for you. Most tanks try to deal with this by counter-swapping constantly themselves, but even if you do this, you're usually just going to end up being counter-swapped immediately after. At least for me, it's not the way I prefer to play. In any hero-based game that I play, I find that sticking to 1 or 2 heroes is usually the best way to improve efficiently, because in order to improve, you need to understand the game at a deeper level, and it's difficult to do that when you're constantly throwing yourself off by switching characters. Even when you're being countered and a matchup feels really bad, it's almost certainly the case that neither you nor the enemy is playing the game perfectly. If you switch heroes every time a matchup gets difficult, you miss out on those opportunities to learn how to deal with your hero's weaknesses, which is a skill that is useful regardless of matchup. Needless to say, many of your teammates will not share this mentality, and you will be asked to swap a lot, even when it's obvious that you're not the problem on your team. And even if you are the problem, people will still sometimes hilariously blame your hero choice before even complaining about your skill. I have the experience of one-tricking Soldier and Baptiste to GM, and I hear relatively few complaints about needing to swap, but on Zarya I find that I receive requests to swap all the time. No tank hero can do everything, and what your hero lacks is precisely what your team will blame as the reason they're losing, no matter what you pick. If you're playing a dive tank, you're losing because you have no frontline. If you're playing a brawl tank, you're losing because you have no peel. And if you're protecting your backline, you're not creating space. The truth is, most solo queue problems have to do with fundamental misunderstandings of the game, and are therefore solvable without swapping heroes. I think many players fall into the trap of believing that to be versatile, you have to swap heroes. But what I find is that oftentimes you can be just as versatile by simply understanding your hero better and learning to be more creative and adaptable. Tanks indeed do have one-dimensional designs, but that doesn't mean you have to only do the most obvious thing on your hero all the time. At any given moment of the game, there are probably multiple options, and yes, if you only do the most obvious thing, you will definitely feel like your counters are giving you a hard time. So if you want to be a great tank player, I would recommend getting used to the reality of constantly being countered, rather than trying to avoid it. Your long-term progress as a tank player will benefit from learning your counter matchups. It's not an easy task, but once you learn how to deal with your counters without swapping, it gives the enemy team far fewer options to deal with you, and therefore increases your chances of winning. I think the important part about playing into your counters is to recognize how to avoid your weaknesses rather than trying to make up for them. The way you make up for them is by playing into and focusing on your strengths instead. How many counters, especially soft counters, work is by preventing you from doing the easiest thing on your hero, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other things your hero is good at. A good example is playing D.Va into Zarya. If you try to absorb projectiles against Zarya, you'll probably have a pretty hard time. But if you recognize that mobility and burst damage are D.Va's strengths, and are on the other hand Zarya's weaknesses, you'll probably be inclined to play differently. The final point I wanted to make is that as a tank, you have to pay a little bit more attention to team compositions. I find that on damage and support, you can for the most part ignore what your teammates are playing if you're the one that's planning on carrying the game. But on tank, I find that you have to adjust your gameplay a little bit more with respect to your team. For example, if your support comp is Lucio Zenyatta, you're usually going to have to play a bit closer to cover, and even more passively compared to a comp like say Ana Kiriko. If your damage comp is Soldier Bastion, you can sometimes afford to focus more on pressuring the enemy tank compared to a comp like Genji Widowmaker. You don't want to get too caught up in trying to fulfill your quote-unquote hero fantasy. You would be wise to take a look at what your team is playing and scale your expectations and adapt to your available options. Your strengths are still going to be your strengths regardless of team comp, but it's important to remember that certain team comps cover your weaknesses a lot better than other ones. So if you see that your comp doesn't do that, you're going to need to take that into account and play around your weaknesses yourself. Undoubtedly, the game can be much simpler to play when your team synergizes with your favorite hero, but in a solo queue environment, you can't really expect that to happen every game. If your team doesn't synergize with you, similar to the situation with counters, you want to continue sticking to your strengths while avoiding your more exposed weaknesses. Yes, having weaknesses that are so team-dependent can be a bit lame at times, but unfortunately that's just how much of the tank roster works, and it's perhaps part of the reason why the tank meta revolves a lot around more survivable tanks like Orisa and Sigma. Playing tank is like trying to fill up a leaking bucket. You don't have any tape, and there are more holes than you have hands, so trying to cover up the holes is often a hopeless effort, and will never result in the bucket actually being filled. Your only hope is to continually fill the bucket faster than it leaks. And that's pretty much everything I have to say about the tank experience after playing it for about 180 hours. Since many of the points I've made so far have had a slightly negative tone, I did want to add one final positive thing I have to say about the tank experience, and that is that the queue times are really fast. And that's all I have to say for now. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing and leaving a like and comment to support the channel. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day.